Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Noha Nayeri.
And I'm Scott McCandless. It is the week of May 15th, and this is your Monday briefing. The House and Senate are in session this week. President Biden and congressional leaders are expected to meet again this week to discuss the debt limit. The Senate Finance Committee will hold a May 16th hearing on the impact of provisions in the House-passed debt limit bill that would repeal supplemental IRS funding. And the Finance Committee also will hold a May 18th hearing on the tax incentives in the Inflation Reduction Act. The Senate Budget Committee will hold a May 17th hearing on tax revenue and the national debt. Meanwhile, the Joint Economic Committee will hold a May 17th hearing on the impact of the U.S. default crisis on families and businesses. And then internationally, the G7 finance ministers will continue their meeting in Nagata, Japan, which runs through May 13th. Noha?
Thanks, Scott. Last week, Senate Finance Committee held a hearing that was focused in part on U.S. international tax issues, as well as the two-pillar projects. Joining us today to discuss those issues is Pat Brown. Pat, welcome to Policy on Demand.
Great to be here, Noha.
So, Pat, for those who didn't have the time to watch the entire 2 hour and 20 plus minutes of the hearing, could you please just summarize the key tax issues that were discussed?
Well, the first thing I would say is if you didn't get a chance to watch it, good news is you can watch it on replay and you can even speed up the playback so it'll take a little bit less time. But you referred to it as a hearing, and it was really quite fascinating, Noha, because I was going to say it was sort of two hearings in one, but it was really one hearing kind of split into two. The Democratic majority, Chairman Wyden, the Democratic majority, really wanted the focus of the hearing, and hence the title of the hearing had to do with, the biopharma sector and tax issues in the biopharma sector. And in particular, the Democratic majority used their time to question their witnesses on perceived, aggressive tax planning from certain companies and tying that to what they believe to be shortcomings in the TCJA. Okay, and that was the focus from the Democratic side. The Republicans, from their perspective, Ranking Member Crapo and the Republican members of the Finance Committee conducted an entirely separate hearing that was focused very largely on Pillar 2 and the UTPR. And I think it's important to take a step back and focus on just how extraordinary that is. So it's not just that there were two hearings sort of separated, very much into different subject matters. It's that the Republican senators, call it a half a dozen Republican senators, used their time, cameras rolling, microphones on, to talk about an OECD international tax project. Not just in a vacuum, but instead of taking the opportunity to defend essentially the TCJA, which is obviously something that they feel very strongly about in terms of the positive impacts they think the TCJA had, but instead they focused almost entirely on the OECD two-pillar project and the UTPR in particular and its effect on incentives in the U.S. Mm-hmm. Now, again, it's hard to overstate just how extraordinary that is. Mm-hmm. The idea that U.S. senators would spend their time focused on an international tax project. It is certainly not something that's a sort of kitchen table issue for their constituents, but it's obviously something they feel very strongly about. That tells me at least a couple of things. One is they've been hearing an awful lot from taxpayers, from companies who come in to speak about this issue. And two, their staff really did an amazing job in preparing them to talk about a highly technical set of issues that, again, are not necessarily the day-to-day for your typical U.S. senator. So all in all, a really extraordinary hearing for folks who didn't have an opportunity to see it. I would encourage people to watch it if they haven't had the opportunity to do so, because you are not likely to see something like this very frequently.
Pat, the Senate isn't the only institution that's interested in this global minimum tax. Across the Hill, you have the House also interested, and Ways and Means Committee Chairman Jason Smith has said that he would actually like to go to Europe to talk to the leaders there about this global minimum tax issue. The timing of that meeting is a little bit uncertain, partly because of the debt ceiling talks. But if he were to go, what do you think he might be able to accomplish in those conversations? Yeah,
so again, I think a lot of what happened at last week's hearing from the standpoint of the Senate Finance Committee was they wanted to effectively convey a message, I believe, this is speculation on my part, convey a message to folks at the OECD, at the US Treasury Department, and also other governments, let's say in particular in Europe. There is real dissatisfaction with this two-pillar project. I suspect strongly that Chairman Smith's message, if he makes this trip to Europe, which we've been hearing a lot about he may be doing, will be a very similar message. Now, I don't think anyone is confused at this stage as to where Chairman Smith stands on the OECD project, because he's obviously made his feelings clear in writing, in oral statements as well. But I think the purpose of the discussion or the meetings from his perspective will be to sort of draw a line underneath this. Let's make no mistake, there are real concerns about the UTPR an impact in the United States. And I think I would be very surprised if that is not the message that he were to carry if he makes that trip.
So, Pat, final question. I think just kind of like along those same lines. During last week's hearing, I believe it was Senator Langford who made the comment with respect to Congress's lack of involvement in the OECD two-pillar project. What do you think? What kind of role do you think Congress can play going forward?
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting. You mentioned Senator Langford. Another senator, this one of the only Democratic senators who engaged on Pillar 2. Of course, Senator Langford's a Republican, but Senator Warner spoke up essentially to say, look, we are where we are on the Pillar 2 project. Interestingly enough, not a real rousing defense of the project, but a statement that was, we are where we are and we have to figure out a path forward. So I think collectively, what the tax writing committees and the Congress more generally has to figure out, exactly to your point, Noha, we are where we are. Now, what can we do to influence the path forward? Obviously, one of the things they can do is continue to reach out to the Treasury Department and the White House and say, there are real problems with this project that need to be addressed. But ultimately, the Treasury Department carries that message, has to carry that message into discussions at the OECD. So at some level, Congress's involvement will continue to be in some way indirect. I do think, though, one of the things that Congress has clearly, in both chambers now, has shown an interest in doing is sort of drawing a line, underneath the issues that are of importance to the Congress, and they would say of importance to the United States. So I would expect continued congressional focus and inquiry around these issues of revenue impacts on the U.S., tying the hands of the Congress with respect to the design of the U.S. system, particularly around things like incentives. I would expect these issues to continue to be the message from Congress. But again, that message at some level has to be delivered indirectly. Members of Congress are not going to participate in the OECD discussions. They will make their voices heard to folks in the Treasury Department. Perhaps to some extent, they will talk as well to governments in Europe or to the OECD. But broadly, this will be an exercise in which Congress says to the Treasury Department, there are issues that need to be addressed. Now you, Treasury, have to go address them.
Pat, thank you so much for your time today.
It's great to be with you guys. Thank you.
And to our viewers, remember to stay tuned for this Friday's Week in Review.
And as always, thank you so much for spending this time with us. Have a great weekend. We'll see you next time.